The Middle East is burning, but this time, the fuse wasn't lit in Tehran or Gaza. It ignited along Israel's northern border, where a new front has torn open with enough force to redraw the entire regional power map. In the early hours before dawn, the skies above northern Israel were transformed from calm blue to a dense web of fire as Hezbollah officially abandoned all restraint, launching an unprecedented mass assault of 300 rockets and loitering munitions within just a few hours. But the real shock wasn't in the volume of projectiles, it was in what happened next. Only 200 were intercepted. The remaining 100 punched straight through the defensive net, slamming into command infrastructure and residential zones, turning northern Israel into a war zone with no safe corridor. For the first time, Iron Dome, the symbol that Western powers spent years elevating to near mythical status, was dragged down from its pedestal by a brutal, precisely calibrated saturation strategy. This was no probing skirmish. This was no diplomatic gesture wrapped in gunpowder. Hezbollah laid its cards on the table, and with that move, a second front swung wide open, and with it, a cascade of punishing questions, now bearing down on Israel's war cabinet. Why did the Iron Dome collapse so quickly? Is the interceptor stockpile running thin, or has the enemy finally mapped a fatal blind spot inside Tel Aviv's air defense algorithm? What is the true financial cost of survival when every interceptor missile worth tens of thousands of dollars must be thrown against crude steel, tubes, and mass-produced suicide drones? And most critically of all, is this only the opening act of a total war capable of shredding whatever remains of the old regional order? Today's analysis will dissect Hezbollah's full-strike architecture, decode the brutal economic equation Israel is being forced to absorb, and map out the most extreme scenario as a strategic vice gripping the Middle East begins to close. The truth this time is far harsher than anything mainstream coverage is willing to say. Before we go further, if this analysis cuts deeper than what you're finding elsewhere, hit like, subscribe, and drop your perspective in the comments. Your engagement keeps this channel independent and sharp. Iron Dome suffocates in a sea of fire. If there is a single moment in modern military history where both technology and confidence collapse in the most unforgiving way possible, it is the pre-dawn hours that just unfolded across northern Israel. For over a decade, Iron Dome was celebrated as the ultimate shield, a near impenetrable system that had repeatedly rescued Israel's civilian population from waves of fire originating in Gaza. But on this defining night, that mythology was brought crashing to earth by its own physical limitations. When Hezbollah activated its strike package, this was not simply a rocket barrage. It was a brutal stress test aimed directly at the foundational logic of Western-designed missile defense. Look at the numbers with cold clarity. 300 incoming targets, rockets and kamikaze drones dropped on a compressed timeline. Roughly 200 were neutralized, nearly 100 were not. For any serious military analyst, this isn't merely a statistic. It is a red alarm signal. A system that once boasted interception rates that made Western partners confident enough to export the model globally just saw its operational ceiling exposed. The cause isn't a simple technical glitch. The cause is that Hezbollah changed the rules of engagement entirely. Saturation tactics were deployed at maximum intensity. Gone were the scattered, exploratory salvos. Hezbollah fired simultaneously from multiple launch positions, exploiting complex terrain to fracture radar tracking and split response capacity. When hundreds of signals appear simultaneously across a radar display, the control system is forced to process an enormous data load in an impossibly short window. That moment of computational overload is where the seams began to tear. But the deeper danger lay in how the targets were layered. Older, low-cost rockets were fed into the swarm as decoys, forcing the defense network to burn through expensive interceptors in volume. Woven in between were UAVs operating at low altitude along unpredictable flight paths, small radar cross-sections, terrain-hugging trajectories, nearly invisible to early warning arrays. These weren't weapons of mass panic. They were precision instruments of systemic exploitation. As launch batteries cycled through intercept sequences, The reload delay and system latency opened windows, and those windows were exactly what Hezbollah's targeting calculus was built around. 100 projectiles reaching their targets was not random variance. It was the output of a tactical formula optimized to a ruthless degree. In Safed, Kiryat Shmona, and surrounding communities, residents spent the night crammed into shelters as the distinction between warning signal and explosion collapsed into a single, continuous roar. Above them, white interceptor trails and orange rocket streaks stitched together into a canopy of violence. But every gap in that canopy was paid for on the ground below. Military installations, power infrastructure, and civilian areas all registered hits. What emerged in the aftermath was something that had previously existed only in theoretical planning documents. No system is absolute. Israel had built its civil resilience model on the assumption that Iron Dome could absorb the vast majority of incoming threats. That assumption took a direct strike last night when 1 in 3 attacking projectiles reached its target. This means the system has reached a threshold. A finite defensive architecture cannot indefinitely absorb an adversary with a vast, continuously replenished arsenal. But the physical damage is only one dimension. The deeper wound is psychological. Iron Dome was never purely a military instrument. It was the psychological spine of Israeli civilian stability and economic continuity. When confidence in it erodes, the downstream effects are immediate. Financial markets reacted within hours. Social media filled with verified impact footage from urban areas. The calm that the system was designed to project gave way to a baseline of anxiety that no interceptor can restore. Hezbollah accomplished something significant in this phase, beyond the explosions themselves. It demonstrated that even the densest defensive layers can be penetrated when the right tactical architecture is applied. In Tel Aviv's war rooms, the calculation has shifted to one without comfortable options. Continue the current defensive posture and accept accelerating resource depletion, particularly the diminishing interceptor stockpile that cannot be reconstituted overnight. Or transition to a ground offensive into Lebanon and step directly into a terrain that Hezbollah has been preparing for years. Neither path is clean. Last night was not simply an event. It was a benchmark. It exposed the ceiling of a defensive doctrine that had been treated as the regional gold standard. And when a system hits its ceiling, every strategic calculation below it must be revised. Hawks tear through the sky. Hezbollah's revealed capability and Israel's exposure. If anyone still carries the outdated mental image of Hezbollah as sandal-wearing guerrillas lobbing unguided rockets into open fields, the pre-dawn hours over Israel just delivered a cold, decisive correction. What unfolded was not a disorganized harassment campaign. It was a display of a structured warfare architecture, organized with the discipline of a conventional military force, operating with an asymmetric mindset, refined to an exceptional level of sophistication. Behind that capability is Iranian technological backing that has fundamentally re-engineered what Hezbollah can do on the battlefield, elevating the organization to an entirely different operational tier. The defining shift in this strike package was the prominent role played by precision-guided munitions. This is not the era of firing 30 rockets and hoping for statistical luck. Hezbollah has now mastered systems comparable to the Fateh 110 family and its domestically adapted variants refined for specific battlefield conditions. These are not random steel projectiles. They are guided attack tools equipped with navigation systems and terminal seekers capable of achieving accuracy measured in single-digit meters. That shift changes the fundamental character of the engagement. Targets are no longer broad areas selected to generate mass panic. The objective has transitioned to high-value nodes with critical tactical significance radar surveillance stations, air defense launcher sites, military data centers, and command hubs scattered across northern Israel. When a precision munition locks onto one of these, the defensive system is compelled to respond at maximum priority, burning through its most valuable assets to protect its most critical infrastructure. Hezbollah understands this logic intimately and exploits it without hesitation. Precision munitions in this context are not just weapons. They are surgical instruments that cut into the nervous system of a defense network, triggering cascading paralysis from the tactical level all the way up to the command tier. Yet the most tactically sophisticated dimension of the campaign doesn't stop at guided rockets. It lives in the integration of those rockets with loitering munitions. While high-trajectory salvos screamed across radar screens, pulling tracking systems toward the upper atmosphere, small, low observable UAVs hugged the terrain at the base of Lebanon's complex topography, moving like shadows without acoustic signatures. These platforms carry minimal radar cross-sections and fly at altitudes that challenge early warning coverage. They don't arrive in walls of fire. They navigate, adapt to terrain, and converge on their designated targets at angles that exploit gaps in point defense coverage. Evidence has emerged suggesting that specific UAV missions were tasked against Iron Dome launcher batteries at the moment of their firing cycle, turning the act of defensive response itself into a vulnerability. When a launcher reveals its position through operation, it becomes a target. That is an extraordinarily refined tactical concept, one that transforms Israel's own defensive effort into a liability. When the shield is being penetrated from the inside, the defender faces compounding crisis. Military analysts describe this as swarm warfare, a synthesis of volume, intelligence, and coordination that generates pressure exceeding the processing capacity of any fixed defensive architecture. A central question emerges: why did Hezbollah choose this specific moment to commit its full operational spectrum? The answer lies in timing exploitation. Israel is currently stretched across multiple theaters from the southern front to regional pressure points, creating a force distribution problem. Opening a full-scale northern front precisely at that moment of dispersal generates a compounding burden, forcing a division of resources and imposing impossible prioritization choices. This is not simply a military strike. It is a strategic stress test designed to force Israel to make explicit trade-offs between survival priorities. And simultaneously, it carries an indirect message to Washington. Any escalatory move against Iran's extended network will be paid for in Israeli security directly. Hezbollah has transitioned from auxiliary force to a full pillar of a regional deterrence structure, with Iran at the coordinating center. What creates the most sustained difficulty for Israel is the absence of a conventional target set to destroy. There are no large, identifiable bases. The entire weapons infrastructure is dispersed, buried deep underground, embedded within civilian geography, and within an elaborate tunnel network constructed across years of meticulous preparation. Launch platforms appear, fire, and vanish in operationally compressed windows that make counter-battery response both expensive and frequently ineffective. This turns the battlefield into a prolonged pursuit, where one side expends enormous resources, hunting targets that are nearly invisible, while the other simply waits for the optimal moment to re-emerge. Every hour, Israeli air assets must maintain high operational tempo, searching for and suppressing launch positions. Hezbollah simply exercises patience and initiative simultaneously. The world is now being forced to revise its understanding of what Hezbollah actually is. This is no longer a guerrilla organization in a meaningful sense. It has developed into a multi-domain military entity capable of sophisticated combined arms coordination. The integration of conventional rockets, precision missiles, and loitering munitions has produced a complete operational ecosystem that has permanently changed the battlefield equation. Israel can no longer rely solely on its air superiority to guarantee dominance. When the Hawk Doctrine is deployed comprehensively, the sky is no longer an unchallenged sanctuary. But behind the kinetic exchange, a quieter and equally decisive contest is unfolding: the war of cost and sustainability. Each interception event consumes resources at a rate that the offensive side does not have to match. The question is not only who controls the sky, but who can sustain the competition longer. $50,000 evaporating every second, the financial trap driving Israel toward collapse. In contemporary military doctrine, victory does not belong exclusively to the side that aims better. It belongs to the side that can remain standing the longest inside a prolonged war of attrition. Viewed from the surface, Iron Dome is still performing intercepts at scale, generating an impression of control and dominance. But when the metal is turned over, a far less comfortable reality emerges. Israel is being drawn by Hezbollah into an economically asymmetric conflict, one where each defensive action isn't just a military response, but a recurring incision into the national treasury in Tel Aviv. Consider a calculation that is both simple and deeply sobering. A single Tamir interceptor missile, the core munition of Iron Dome, carries a unit cost ranging from $40,000 to $50,000. To achieve reliable kill probability against an incoming threat, Israeli doctrine typically requires 2 interceptors per target. That means each interception event consumes approximately $100,000. On the other side of the engagement, a Katyusha rocket variant or comparable munition fielded by Hezbollah carries a production cost of roughly $300 to $500. This isn't merely a numerical gap. It is a structural, strategic asymmetry. Israel is committing high-value assets to neutralize low-cost instruments, and that ratio defines an attrition dynamic whose outcome is nearly predetermined. With a salvo of 300 rockets, Hezbollah expends under $150,000, a trivial sum relative to the financial support flowing through the regional network that Iran anchors. In response, Israel burns through approximately $15 million in interceptor costs alone within a matter of hours. Operating expenses, logistics overhead, and collateral damage from leakage haven't even been factored in. Hezbollah has no illusion that it can defeat Israel through territorial conquest or conventional confrontation. Its strategy is the construction of a sustained attrition chain 1, where the adversary is worn down incrementally until its capacity for continuation degrades. Iron Dome, originally conceived as a strategic shield, is being systematically converted into a resource consumption engine. By maintaining a continuous offensive rhythm at a tempo just sufficient to generate maximal defensive response without overextending its own operational capacity, Hezbollah locks Israel into a state of permanent maximum readiness defense 24 hours per day. Every signal on a radar screen triggers a response. Every response drains the account. This is economic warfare fused with psychological pressure at the highest operational level, an environment where the adversary is forced to interrogate its own long-term viability. As interceptor reserves decline, Israel becomes increasingly dependent on American resupply pipelines. But Washington's capacity is not unlimited, particularly as it balances simultaneous global commitments across multiple theaters. Every congressional appropriations debate over military aid carries political friction that creates indirect strategic leverage for Hezbollah and Iran. The budget argument in Washington is a battle they don't have to fight themselves. The political system fights it for them. The $100,000 per intercept figure represents only the visible surface. When the defensive network is saturated and a meaningful number of projectiles breach the perimeter, the secondary economic damage begins cascading outward. A rocket costing a few $100s can destroy a power substation or critical infrastructure node, triggering millions of dollars in cascading damage and disrupting production chains across entire industrial sectors. Israel's economic model also carries a structural vulnerability in times of sustained conflict. The reserve mobilization system pulls tens of thousands of workers from their civilian roles and embeds them in an active combat environment. That displacement removes productive economic capacity from the national output, directly suppressing growth in tax revenues while simultaneously increasing state expenditure. The displacement of civilian populations from northern communities generates further pressure, housing support, relocation subsidies, social stability, maintenance, all becoming expanding line items in a wartime budget already under compounding strain. Synthesized together, these pressures compose a financial siege operating in parallel to the kinetic engagement. Israel now faces a decision matrix with no favorable branch. Sustaining the current defensive posture means accepting the slow bleed of financial attrition across an indeterminate timeline. Alternatively, pursuing a ground operation into Lebanon to eliminate the threat at its source opens a scenario priced dramatically higher in both treasure and personnel, against terrain specifically prepared to inflict maximum cost on any advancing force. Hezbollah has spent years converting southern Lebanon into an environment designed to strip technological advantage from any conventional military attempting to operate within it. Laser-guided precision and fifth-generation aircraft don't neutralize tunnel networks and anti-tank ambush corridors. Israel is actively exploring alternatives, laser-based intercept systems with substantially lower per-shot costs, but those remain developmental timelines. The present operational reality is that each intercept carries a $100,000 price tag, and the clock is running. When resources are being stretched and degraded simultaneously, the surrounding strategic environment begins shifting in ways that compound the pressure. Israel forced into check, Iran's strategic vice tightens. If the battlefield is a brutal chess match where each move is paid for in blood and capital, then Israel currently occupies the most dangerous positional disadvantage it has faced since the Yom Kippur War of 1973. The military doctrine refers to this as multi-front warfare, but the ground reality is harsher than the terminology implies. A steel vice is compressing Israel's strategic windpipe from two primary axes. From the south, Iran's extended network encompassing pressure from Gaza remnants and Houthi forces in Yemen sustains a continuous drain on attention and assets. From the north, Hezbollah has emerged as a fully constituted fighting entity, resilient, adaptive, and operating at a level of lethality that has permanently reclassified its threat tier. Israel can no longer concentrate its full mass of force against a single adversary of its choosing. The foundational advantage that has historically defined the Israel Defense Force's speed, precision, the ability to mass firepower rapidly at a decisive point is being systematically diluted by a conflict architecture deliberately designed to deny exactly that. When Hezbollah opened with its mass salvo, it wasn't purely a kinetic strike. It was a direct attack on Israel's strategic nervous system. Elite units that were oriented toward deeper operational objectives were forced to pivot and reinforce the Lebanon border. Extending the defensive line from the Mediterranean coastline to the Golan Plateau fragments responsiveness and creates the kind of distributed vulnerability that a sophisticated adversary can probe and exploit. One exposed seam at the wrong moment becomes an irreversible disadvantage. Israel is now forced to portion out its rarest assets, interceptor reserves, radar coverage, F-35 sorties across multiple simultaneous demands. This is precisely the attrition architecture that Iran has been constructing across years of patience and investment. Force the adversary to dilute, distribute, and deplete, then apply asymmetric pressure at the seams. Multi-front warfare doesn't only drain finances, it stretches logistics to a breaking point. Sustaining concurrent operations across the northern and southern theaters demands massive volumes of transportation, fuel, and essential material flowing continuously. Supply lines transform into targets of opportunity for Hezbollah's highly mobile strike teams units that can materialize, strike, and dissolve back into terrain within operational windows, so compressed that counter-response becomes prohibitively expensive. A few well-placed strikes against logistical convoys can cascade into cascading combat effectiveness degradation. Meanwhile, the reserve mobilization burden is intensifying. Israel's military model depends on a massive reserve call-up to staff its wartime force structure. Every activation cycle removes civilians from productive economic roles and deposits them into a sustained, high-stress combat environment. Psychological pressure accumulates across months of activation. Operational effectiveness degrades in proportion. When the backbone of a military is exhausted before the decisive engagement, technological superiority becomes insufficient to compensate. The encirclement strategy extends beyond Lebanon's border. Houthi forces in Yemen, operating with upgraded Iranian-origin ballistic missiles and maritime attack drones, have continued degrading southern shipping lanes, their campaign against commercial traffic in the Red Sea corridor, forcing major carriers to divert or suspend operations. This isn't peripheral harassment. It's a coordinated economic strangulation line operating in geographic synchronization with Hezbollah's northern pressure and the sustained drain from Gaza. The combined architecture creates a multi-layered attack framework. Hezbollah degrades Israel's military capacity through attrition, the Houthis apply economic pressure through maritime disruption, and Iran provides the strategic coordination binding the entire structure together into a coherent campaign. This is a model of integrated warfare that Israel has never faced at this scale or level of synchronization. In this context, Israel looks toward Washington with a combination of expectation and realism. The United States can provide equipment, intelligence, and technical support, but direct engagement in multiple simultaneous theaters carries political and military costs that Washington is carefully calibrating. The stretching of Israeli force structure also implies a corresponding dispersion of American commitment, reducing Washington's capacity to concentrate elsewhere. Internal political pressure on Capitol Hill, combined with the institutional caution that follows a decade of costly Middle East interventions, has produced a measured rather than unconditional American posture. Hezbollah has grasped this dynamic and operates accordingly, demonstrating that even with superpower backing, Israel cannot guarantee absolute security within a conflict architecture of this complexity. Before this pressure, Israel faces branching choices with no clean path. Sustaining the defensive model means accepting incremental erosion without a decisive resolution. Committing to a large-scale ground offensive into Lebanon means engaging an adversary that has invested years in building a defensive environment purpose-designed to maximize attacker attrition tunnel systems, fortified positions, pre-registered anti-armor ambush corridors. Expanding the conflict envelope to directly target Iran escalates to a dimension that would fundamentally transform the nature of the entire regional engagement. Every decision at this juncture carries the weight of a potential turning point. No option is clean. No option is cheap. Israel's furious counterstrike, overwhelming response, unbroken will. Israel is not a nation conditioned to absorb strikes without response, and its air force carries that doctrine forward with lethal precision. As Hezbollah transformed northern skies into a rolling barrage, Israel's response came before first light had fully reached the Lebanese ridgelines. F-35, Adir fighters launched into the pre-dawn darkness, tearing through the atmosphere on a counterstrike campaign designed to reassert dominance and reestablish deterrence math. This wasn't a measured proportional reply. It was a precision-guided, overwhelming response targeting the operational infrastructure that made Hezbollah's assault possible. Beneath the direction of experienced combat crews, fifth-generation stealth platforms threaded through available air defense coverage, locking onto pre-identified target sets. From altitude, American-supplied bunker-penetrating munitions were released, striking launch infrastructure in the Bekaa Valley and surrounding zones with sequential detonations that rolled across the landscape in cascading shockwaves. Secondary explosions confirmed weapons storage impacts. Pillars of black smoke visible from dozens of kilometers confirmed the scale of the strikes. The message Tel Aviv was transmitting was unambiguous. The capability and the will to strike deep remained fully intact. In the command center, Israel's senior leadership reinforced a posture of absolute reciprocity. No attack goes unanswered. No threshold is crossed without consequence. The operational capacity behind this campaign is not purely domestic. American weapons transfers have included precision munitions and specialized penetrating bombs capable of reaching targets, protected under significant earth and concrete cover, exactly the infrastructure Hezbollah has embedded deep underground across years of preparation. The strategic logic of the Israeli strike package centered on degrading command and control architecture and disrupting the operational coordination networks that enabled the mass salvo, with the objective of reducing the adversary's capacity to replicate the attack at the same scale. However, behind the spectacle of a successful air campaign, a persistent and uncomfortable reality remains. Strikes from altitude can inflict meaningful losses, but they cannot reliably destroy the will or the organizational resilience of a force that has spent decades conditioning itself for precisely this kind of pressure. Mobile launchers that survive an initial strike package can be repositioned within hours, hidden in terrain that aerial surveillance cannot fully penetrate, prepared for the next activation window. This is the fundamental tension between air power and counter-guerrilla operations. The former can suppress and degrade, but it cannot extinguish a decentralized human network that has made dispersal and survivability its core operating principle. Israel's air arm remains its most decisive unilateral instrument. But the leadership understands in the classified briefing rooms, if not always in the public messaging, that air power alone does not resolve the threat architecture Hezbollah has constructed. Each sortie is a strategic choice where military effect must be weighed against escalation, risk, munitions expenditure, and the diplomatic temperature in Washington and Brussels. External powers are watching the strike campaigns carefully, not to intervene, but to calibrate. The United States, Russia, and China are each assessing the operational data, extrapolating toward their own strategic positions, and calculating what posture serves their interests as the conflict's next phase takes shape. The counteroffensive has been launched. The fires are burning in the Bekaa, but the architecture of the threat has not been dismantled. It has been pressured. The war's trajectory remains genuinely open. The chilling silence of the superpowers behind the ceasefire theater. Amid the walls of fire tearing across the Middle East, amid the successive explosions and cities being reshaped by sustained bombardment, the world's major powers have settled into a state of composure that borders on unsettling. Ceasefire appeals continue to circulate across diplomatic channels and UN podiums with the regularity of a scheduled broadcast. But they exist as language, not as action. No decisive intervention follows. No immediate enforcement mechanism activates. No large-scale humanitarian operation deploys with urgency matching the scale of the crisis. This silence is not indifference. It is the expression of a calculated, layered strategic patience in which each major power is observing the battlefield, measuring outcomes, and positioning within a geopolitical chess game of exceptional danger. Washington's decision-making centers remain in continuous operation, but rather than the declaratory muscularity that characterized earlier American postures in the region, the current administration is displaying a controlled, deliberate restraint that carries significant strategic content. The White House is navigating a genuinely complex dilemma: how to sustain the commitment to Israel's security while avoiding entanglement in a full-spectrum conflict against Iran, an adversary that has demonstrated strategic endurance and adaptive capacity far exceeding original Western projections. American planners understand that direct, deep engagement on two simultaneous fronts could trigger the precise economic detonation that weakens the domestic political foundation most critical to sustained policy: energy prices. A full Strait of Hormuz disruption scenario could drive crude oil to levels that cascade through American consumer prices and generate political headwinds with no clean exit. Washington's posture is therefore calibrated at the boundary between deterrence and restraint, present, visible, but not fully committed to the vortex. The silence from the United States carries a clear implicit signal. Unconditional backing has upper limits when weighed against total strategic cost. Moscow's approach carries a different geometry entirely. Russia observes with the composed patience of an experienced geopolitical actor who recognizes that regional turmoil in the Middle East relieves pressure in other theaters simultaneously. When Western attention and resources are absorbed into the Eastern Mediterranean crisis, the distribution of strategic focus shifts in ways that benefit Russian positioning elsewhere. The Kremlin does not require direct involvement. The conflict's gravitational pull on Western capacity is itself the outcome Moscow finds most useful. Russia's existing cooperative framework with Iran spanning energy, defense technology, and strategic coordination provides additional structural reinforcement for its indirect advantages within the current dynamics. The silence from Moscow is not a vacuum, it is a strategic election. Beijing employs yet another posture characteristically flexible, non-confrontational in public messaging, and deeply pragmatic in underlying calculation. China declines explicit alignment with any combatant, maintaining simultaneously its role as an economic partner to multiple regional actors and its image as a responsible global stakeholder. For Beijing, the Middle East is not simply a conflict zone. It is a critical node in energy supply chains and trade route architecture that underpins the economic foundation of Chinese growth projections. The Chinese silence is preparatory positioning for a future moment when reconstruction need, energy stabilization, and investment opportunity converge, and when economic leverage and capital deployment will generate influence more durable than any military insertion could produce. Quiet accumulation of strategic positioning, while others exhaust themselves, is a model Beijing has refined across decades. International institutions, meanwhile, have been rendered effectively ceremonial in this environment. Draft resolutions fail to achieve consensus. Appeals are issued and ignored. A visible power vacuum has opened across the multilateral architecture, and within it, the operative rules are being set not by international norms, but by the real-time correlation of forces on the ground. The simultaneous silence of these three powers, driven by entirely different calculations, produces a fragile equilibrium. The equilibrium of intersecting interests in which no party is willing to cross the threshold that triggers direct superpower confrontation, but none is willing to impose the intervention that would stop the existing one. This equilibrium is inherently unstable. Its existence permits the conflict to continue without an effective ceiling. Within this architecture, Iran has emerged as the central coordinating actor, not simply because of its direct involvement, but because of its demonstrated capacity to shape regional dynamics without overextending. The strategic patience and operational autonomy Iran has displayed has forced every major power to shift from confrontational to cautious modes of engagement. When superpowers choose observation over intervention, they are effectively acknowledging that the environment has shifted beyond the point where a single dominant will can impose order. The Middle East is no longer a space where one external power enforces outcomes. It has become a genuinely multipolar zone where every calculated step carries consequence. This silence is not a conclusion. It is the signature of a transitional period, the old order completing its withdrawal while a new regional structure has not yet fully crystallized. Within that interstitial space, the full range of outcomes remains possible, from a temporary cessation that buys diplomatic breathing room to an escalation that exceeds every party's capacity to control. The worst-case scenario, total war across the Middle East. When the last diplomatic mechanism has been incinerated in the fire, the world is forced to look directly at the darkest possible trajectory, a total war without territorial limits, where every established rule is shredded and every boundary is erased. This is no longer a conflict of border skirmishes. This would be a strategic hurricane capable of consuming the entire Middle East in a conflagration from which no participating nation escapes without fundamental transformation. This scenario begins when Israel's war cabinet, watching its defensive capacity being progressively ground down, reaches the threshold of strategic impatience and commits to full-scale escalation. Armored brigades roll north across the Lebanese border with the declared intent of eliminating Hezbollah's launch infrastructure at the source. But the historical record issues an unambiguous warning that terrain is not accommodating to conventional force projection. Complex topography, an extensive tunnel network refined over years, and ambush doctrine honed against exactly this type of operation will convert technological advantage into irrelevance. Modern anti-tank missiles will be waiting inside every rocky hillside and every prepared firing position, turning the most sophisticated armored vehicles on Earth into burning wreckage. This war would not be won through speed or firepower. It would be paid for in personnel attrition across a grinding, indeterminate timeline. As Israel is being drawn into that attritional trap, Iran executes a response with maximum strategic reach: closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The most critical single choke point in the global energy system would be transformed into a denied zone through a combination of fast attack craft, naval mines, and cruise missile coverage. The flow of petroleum from the Persian Gulf, representing a substantial fraction of global supply, would be severed or severely degraded. Global oil markets would react instantly. Prices would breach levels without modern precedent. From Europe to East Asia, economies operating on thin margin assumptions would face inflationary shocks with no short-term remedy. Social stability mechanisms in multiple countries would come under pressure simultaneously. This is not a regional military move. It is a strike against the structural foundation of the global economy, and it is among the most potent deterrence instruments Iran holds in reserve. As the scenario reaches its upper register, the conflict architecture expands across all vectors simultaneously. Hezbollah intensifies from the north. Houthi forces lock down southern maritime corridors. Iranian-aligned networks in Syria and Iraq activate along a strategic arc that encircles Israel from multiple approach angles. Under that combined pressure, the decision calculus in Tel Aviv begins approaching the most extreme contingency, a nuclear dimension that has never been formally acknowledged, but has shaped Israeli strategic doctrine for decades. If that threshold is crossed, the Middle East is no longer a conflict theater. It becomes a zone of long-duration devastation, whose consequences extend across generations and whose geographic scope of contamination cannot be bounded. The entire political and economic ecosystem of the region would require reconstruction under a radically altered power distribution. What is unfolding now is not simply military conflict, it is a historical inflection. The old order is losing structural integrity faster than a replacement framework can be assembled. Israel's technological edge is under attrition pressure. It cannot sustain indefinitely. Hezbollah is generating real military costs while simultaneously dragging Lebanon toward catastrophe. Iran has consolidated its position as the regional coordinating center, demonstrating that its influence extends not only across the neighborhood, but into the mechanisms of the global system. External powers continue holding calculated distance, watching and adjusting, making the overall trajectory less predictable with each passing cycle. Every contrail in the sky and every explosion on the ground is a reminder that peace is the most fragile condition that exists within international relations. When conflict passes the point of controllable parameters, no party can know where its true boundary lies. What is happening in the Middle East today is not a story that belongs to one country or to one region. It touches energy pricing, supply chain integrity, and financial security for households on every continent. This is not one nation's problem. It is the defining stress test of a global system navigating its most turbulent transition in decades. The question that remains before all of this is not whether the worst case will materialize, but whether any remaining circuit breaker exists before it does. What is Iran's actual role in this geometry stabilizing actor, or the force that permanently rewrites the rules? Leave your perspective in the comments. If this analysis reached something the mainstream coverage is missing, share it, hit like, and subscribe. Next update brings you the sharpest, most unfiltered read on how this battlefield continues to evolve. Until then, stay sharp.